Good morning, Ollie at Berkeley, and welcome to our town hall. Today's town hall will be themed post-election wrap-up. And what we've done for this town hall is assemble a cohort of Ollie faculty who we thought might help us to better understand the implications of the election and where we can go from here. Today's host is Ollie at Berkeley and UC Berkeley, Professor Darren Zook. Darren, welcome, and the floor is yours.
The floor? You mean the digital floor? Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Matt. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We are going to have the first part of today's program. We're going to hear from our panelists, and we're here to try to help you make sense of everything. And I'm sure within an hour and a half, we'll do exactly that. After today, you'll have no questions left whatsoever because you'll have all the answers you need. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that's probably a good way to be right now. I think a little optimism is something that will carry us through. So you're going to hear a number of different perspectives as you're listening to each of our panelists. If you have any questions, the way to do this on Zoom, I'm sure you're all seasoned Zoom experts at this point, but the way to do it is to put your questions on Zoom. You can put them to everyone. If you have a question you'd like to ask, but not let anyone see it, you can actually send it directly to me. And what I'm going to do is, as we're going through the first part of today's program, I'm going to go through the questions and kind of sort through them, and then we'll leave plenty of time for question and answer towards the end of today's program. So that's how things will go today. And with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this digital floor and I'm going to yield it to our first speaker, who happens to be Bill Sokol. So Bill, take it away.
Thank you so much, Darren. I feel like I have to approach what just happened in a very humble way. I have to deal with it with a good deal of humility because I'm a full-time union side labor lawyer all over the Western United States. And yet I managed to convince myself, as so many of my friends and perhaps many of you did, that Kamala Harris would win, that there would be a blue wave, that people would reject a demagogue who might be a fascist. And instead, he will win the popular vote, probably by 4.5 million votes, 73.5 million to about 69 million, including Hispanic men, 47% of America's vote women. And I have to look at that and say, oh, gee, what happened? How did I so fundamentally misunderstand the people I've worked with my whole life? So let me just go through a few slides that I think set the empirical stage. First slide, this one, very simply, it's showing you since 1980, the bottom decile, 10% of workers who actually work for a living or drawing wages, their wages are actually down over the last 40 years. Those who are in the middle, most of the working class, barely edged up at all, while those of us with college degrees and professions, part of what's called now the elite, we had decent wage increases over that period of time. Next slide, Max. Just going to show you slides to say the same thing in various ways. From 1948 to 73, that was the golden age, the giant expansion of the American economy post-World War II. Productivity doubled, hourly compensation doubled. From 1973 to the present, this is an older chart, but to the present, hourly compensation has been almost flat, while productivity has gone up 243%. People are earning the same in real wages as their fathers and in some cases their grandfathers earned. Next slide. Minimum wage, if it kept up with productivity, would be over $18 an hour now. Instead, the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. And for tipped classes, $2.13 an hour. Really, that's the minimum wage under federal law. Next slide. And we can't forget what NAFTA did. The darkest states on this map are the ones that NAFTA completely gutted, destroyed the manufacturing base in these states. 4.5 million jobs lost. That means 18 million when you include family are affected by it, indirectly affected 40 to 50 million people. And isn't it coincidental that when you look at those that were hit hardest, it includes Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas, Florida. Sound familiar? You know that list, right? Next slide. And what we end up with is tremendous income inequality that is hard for anyone in the working class to miss. It's hard to not realize that a very small part of Americans owns almost everything. These charts show financial wealth, 75% goes to the top 5%. It shows it with respect to net worth, 65% goes to the top 5%. 80%, the rest of us, we have 11% of the net worth, 5% of financial wealth. This is income inequality worse than any other period in American history so far as we can figure out, and it's traced. Next slide. And of course, what happens is, as the share of the income that we are getting goes, more and more of it goes to the top 10%, union membership drops. The wealthier the elite, that 1% becomes, the worse off it is for union membership, unions being decimated by corporate America. So let's go one more. Thank you. Where do we end up? What's happened here? What's really happened? We have to listen. I have to listen. People said, what did this to them? What changed? All that, I've shown you 50 years of history. What's new in the last 4 years? Two things. Number one, inflation. The entire new millennium, it's been 1% to 2%. During the Biden years, 6% year over year, which means people are paying 3 times as much for eggs as they did when Trump was president. The cars they buy, they're paying them off on a monthly basis. They owe more on those cars than what the car's worth if they try to sell in the market. And we can't forget 2008, 2009, when millions of people were foreclosed on with respect to their homes. All of that economic pain. But what's new right now is A, that incredible inflation that makes it so hard to get by, so people are buying groceries on their credit cards, and B, this illusion created of millions of immigrants pouring across the border who are going to steal jobs, work for less, and destroy communities. So people were willing to take a chance to listen to a demagogue. They know he's a liar, he's a cheat, he's a sexual predator, he's a felon. But what he said to me and all of mine, to the, if you will, college-educated elite who were doing all right, he flipped us the finger. He said, I'm not going to be like the Democrats or the Republicans. Screw you all. And that's what they're willing to take a chance on because times are now so desperate. It's about desperation and despair. That's what's really driven, I think, the American working class to try something desperate. Nothing further.
All right. Thanks so much, Bill, for that tremendously concise overview of so many things. We are going to move right along. We already have some questions rolling in, but we're going to move right along to our next panelist, who happens to be Arlie Hochschild. So she has quite a bit to contribute on this election, I'm sure. So Arlie, I'm going to yield the digital floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bill, for giving us such a concise picture of the backstory to the discontent, especially among the 42% of Americans who are white and without a BA, and who are the base of MAGA. So let me add to Bill's story the next step. That's kind of the backstory. What's the front story? What we have then are highly discontented people, large sector, who have suffered loss of their jobs, loss of their security, the loss of their pride. My last book, new book, is about that lost pride. They have been, in a way, because of loss of unions, given up on regular, rational leadership in a way, and turned to a charismatic leader. What's to lose? Let's try something new. And so the front story that I think has been hard for a lot of us to see is that Donald Trump, charismatic figure, says, look, don't worry about policies. I'm a magical answer to your loss and to your shame. because that's what happened. Loss in an individualistic culture where you blame yourself for bad news, you take credit yourself for good news, leads to a kind of a shame. And I think Donald Trump has succeeded to capture and then fix the psyche of this frightened, downwardly mobile sector through an anti-shame ritual that we can't hear. We need to listen, become bilingual, rational, emotional, and listen to the logic of the emotional story, which goes in 4 moments. Moment 1, Donald Trump says something transgressive. Asian immigrants are eating your pet cats. Moment 2, the punditry shames Donald Trump. And says, you can't say that. It's not true. You repeat a lie. Moment 3, Donald Trump becomes the victim of the shamers. And look, it's so hard. You know, they're all after me. Haven't they been after you? They're shaming me. Haven't they shamed you? And in moment 4, Donald Trump roars back at the shamers. So here, what do we have? We have Donald Trump, a kind of a shamed guy personally, which would be neither here nor there, except that it's given him X-ray vision into a structural shame of the whole sector Bill just described the history of. And they're in response. And he takes this almost religious cleansing function. I will take on your shame and relieve you of it and turn shame to blame. They were already doing that some, but he legitimated that, and in blame into revenge. So we have to ask over all these years, you know, from 16 on, the fixity of people's devotion to him. And I think the answer lies in emotional appeal. During the 4 years of his presidency in Eastern Kentucky, subject of my last book, Stolen Pride, is the whitest and the second poorest congressional district in the country, that went 80% twice and now thrice for Donald Trump. Used to be FDR Democrats. And so the fixity of their devotion to him, I think, can be explained this way. And we therefore, I think, looking forward, have to become bilingual, listen and understand not just what's rationally being said, but the emotional appeal, hear it from their point of view, and speak to them with some important kind of left-wing answers to real problems. Can be done. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Arlie. I appreciate very much how you brought the kind of personal connection and the kind of emotional part of the election, in the sense that it's not always directly about issues. Thanks so much for that. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Arlie Hochschild. Amazingly, 2 speakers with the last name. So I will just not get in the way of anything. Adam, I'm going to turn the digital floor directly over to you.
Amazing coincidence, that last name. But I like to look at things from a historical perspective, and I think sometimes at a grim moment like this, that can be comforting, because it tells us we have been here before. I think there are 2 parts of Trump's appeal that have very deep roots. One is his rage against immigrants. That's something that has a long tradition in this country. He didn't invent it. Demagogues have used it for nearly 200 years. There were anti-Catholic riots at the time, that in the 1850s, when huge numbers of people came here from Ireland after the potato famine. The state of Massachusetts expelled thousands of Catholics in that era. Later on in the 19th century, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1885, 28 Chinese miners were massacred in Wyoming. Then there was much violence against Jewish immigrants when the big wave of Jews began coming here in the late 1880s and 1890s, fleeing pogroms in Europe. So demagogues in the United States have always known that they can dip into that reservoir of potential rage against immigrants, which the United States has long had, despite the fact that we're a country that is almost entirely built upon immigration. So that's been with us for a long time. I think also the MAGA appeal, Make America Great Again, is another familiar refuge of demagogues. The Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski has a wonderful phrase that applies to these people who talk about the great yesterday. And you can see that in many other places as well. In Serbia during the Balkan Wars, where the demagogic leaders there appealed to Serbs, trying to restore the glory they had once had in the Middle Ages. You see it in Russia today, where Putin and his followers are appealing to Russians, trying to restore the great glory that Russia once had when the Soviet Union was part of one of two superpowers, and even before that, when Tsarist Russia controlled a vastly greater territory than Russia has today. So that too is a familiar reservoir of feelings demagogues can always tap into. And of course, the Make Something Great Again was the foundation of Hitler's appeal to Germany. Here was Germany devastated by the First World War, nearly 2 million soldiers killed, millions of others severely wounded. The war ends. In effect, it's a surrender for Germany. They lose part of their territory, including much of their richest coal reserves. Population shrinks, endure ruinous inflation, have to pay reparations, deep humiliation. So Hitler comes along and says, we will make Germany great again. Classic type of demagogic appeal. Now, that raises the question, is our grim moment right now the equivalent of Germany in January 1933, when Hitler had just taken power? I think in some ways it is. We have a fascist leader, or we will after January 2nd, 20th, have a fascist leader with powerful support from parts of big business in this country. That's a dangerous combination. And there's no question that we're going to be in a very dangerous moment for years after that. I think in other ways, we are not in the equivalent of Germany in January 1933. And I hope we can take some comfort from this and look at ways to strengthen the ways that we're different. One, I think, is that we have a strong constitutional order in this country. Since the Civil War, it has never really been effectively challenged. And of course, that challenge was defeated with much bloodshed. Many people would have liked to have overturned the Constitution. Richard Nixon, unquestionably. January 6, 2021, they made an attempt to invade the Capitol, but it failed. But I think Americans do have a pretty widespread effect for the Constitution, despite Trump's often expressed wish to set it aside or revise it. Secondly, again, compared to Germany, 1933, I think we have a much stronger civil society with some strong institutions. There was a nice advertisement in the New York Times today from the ACLU that said, we're not moving to Canada, and reminded people of all the lawsuits they had filed during Trump's first presidency. A third difference, I think, is that we have, again, compared to Germany 1933, a better established court system. with fairly widespread obedience and respect for it. It's true that we have a horrible Supreme Court right now, but maybe Bill can correct me if I'm on this, if I'm wrong. In the lower federal courts, the district courts and courts of appeal, a slight majority of judges there have been appointed by Democrats. And lastly, I think compared to Germany 33 and to other countries at other times, we have a quite strong federal system in this country with major powers in the hands of the states. I'm pleased that Governor Newsom has called a special session of the legislature in December to talk about ways to Trump-proof some of California's gains against federal attempts to roll them back. The governor of Illinois is talking about the same thing. And I think this also is a safeguard. But despite all of these differences, I certainly would not try to pretend that this isn't a very dangerous moment, and that all of us in every way we can have to make sure that Trump is not in the long run going to prevail. So I'll stop right there.
All right. Thanks so much, Adam, for the wonderfully concise and yet amazingly rich historical background, historical comparisons. I think that's going to be very helpful for many people who might be very worried that, as with 2016, we're somehow in this moment of Germany in 1933. We have one more speaker left to go for a panel, and thank you for the questions that are rolling in. So I am going to turn the digital floor over to Sandra Bass. So Sandra, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm also going to show some slides. So just give me a moment. Oops, sorry. Great. So I'm a political scientist by training, and for the last 10 years, I've spent my time working at the intersection between higher ed, student leadership and development, and working with nonprofit organizations and social movements. So I really want to focus on the youth vote. I saw a number of questions in the chat about it. This is data that comes out of an organization called the Center for Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or Sokol. And they're out of Tufts. And they're, to my mind, one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies of voting among young adults. And they define that as people between the ages of 18 and 29. This is also really recent, as you can imagine, so these may change a little bit. But the number one thing is that we saw less youth voting this time. About 42% voted overall, which is significantly lower than in 2020, so about 10 percentage points, more similar to what happened in 2016. Where you saw a flat sort of turnout, very similar to 2020, is in the battleground states. And particularly in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And in total, youth cast about 14% of the ballots this election. As Bill said, the economy, that's what's on everyone's mind. When young people were polled and asked what was the number one thing, 40% this election said the economy and jobs. I think it's really interesting that abortion didn't poll higher, given how much attention the Democrats gave to that issue as part of their campaign. And I think that's also reflected in some of the gender voting. So looking at the young adult voting by gender, everybody moved rightward, and we'll see that in some other slides as well, some more significantly than others. So young women, 65% supported Biden in 2020. This year, about 58% supported Harris. Young men, a much more significant shift. And for the first time, they've started to poll non-binary, gender non-conforming folks, and you can see overwhelmingly supported Harris. When you start looking at that by race, it gets even more telling, I think. And I'm going to look at this slide from the bottom up. So if you look at the bottom, we almost never talk about Asian American Pacific Islander men and women as a voting bloc. But I think this is really significant to see just how many AAPI women supported Harris, as well as among AAPI men. With regards to the Latino vote, you can see that Latino women, 66% supported Harris. Big chunk of Latino men did not support Harris, and they or I'll put it another way, which is we're Democrat last presidential election, and more evenly split between the two candidates this election. Black women, solidly Democratic, 85% voted for Harris. Surprisingly, that's a little bit down from Biden. Even though that's a really strong showing, it was about 90% for Biden. And as we've seen in the news, a big drop among Black men. So 64%, still a pretty significant number voted for Harris, but that's almost 20 percentage points down from who voted for Biden. I think white women are very surprising here. I always hear about this wave of women who are going to come to the polls and, basically make a huge difference in the outcome. Did not happen. And in fact, we saw particularly with young women, about evenly split between the two candidates. And then young white men overwhelmingly supporting Trump. I also saw in the chat that some folks were asking about education. I put this slide in, I'm glad I did, because I do think it's important, particularly for white people. So the Chronicle of Higher Education recently had an article that talked about the drop of enrollment in colleges across the country, which is fairly significant. But the biggest drop has been amongst white students. So they've dropped from 47% in 2018 to 41% in 2023. And if you take that by gender, it's primarily white men who are not going to college. And if you take that by geography, it's a lot of the white men who are in these more rural areas. And I think that, the tragedy of that, in addition to not having, the kind of education we think would be great for a democracy, they're not being engaged with people unlike themselves or ideas unlike themselves. And so it's worth talking about. I think this is something that Arlie spoke to, like how can we support young white people in their aspirations and being connected and feeling like they have a sense of belonging in the country. I also want to talk a little bit about what happened at Berkeley this election. So the Public Service Center is the polling location for the campus. And so this is the picture I took outside our office. We're on the second floor of Eshelman at about maybe 2 o'clock. And this was the line all day, well into the night. Berkeley students turned out in numbers. If you know the campus, that's across Lower Sproul, it's going across Cesar Chavez. It actually started going up the stairs towards Upper Sproul. And those students were not deterred. They were like, we're staying as long as it takes. And some of them, it took 3 hours. Just to give you a sense, that's what it looked like inside of just students packing in to vote. In fact, at one point, I was outside and a reporter came up to me and we were talking about the line. And he actually got emotional about it because I'll be honest, I thought the same. I didn't know what the students were going to do. I'm around them all day. None of them were talking about the election. I tried to sort of get some conversation started, not really interested. And I thought, are they following the news? What are they thinking? And at least at Berkeley campus, they were definitely paying attention. And our voter turnout was about 76% in 2020, and I wouldn't be surprised if it went up several percentage points for this election. The last thing I want to talk about is just the aftermath. My center works with a lot of low-income, first-generation, undocumented, really non-traditional students. And so I convened a small group of them that Wednesday. And devastated. I mean, we had students that were just in tears. The undocumented students in particular are fearful for themselves and their families. The last time that Trump was in office, we had instances of ICE coming to campus. And some students were picked up in that, a very small number, but there's a lot of concern about that happening again. And in fact, our belief is that their fellow students had called ICE to come to campus. So feeling that their fellow students are, against them and don't want them to be there. So in general, they're bracing for what's next, but they are showing up, and I really think what's interesting is when I look at what's happening with young folks, they're very informed and engaged and interested. But what I think we're missing is the capacity to harness that into something that could be a more cohesive movement. So anyways, I'll stop my comments with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. That was a wonderful overview, and I especially appreciate you speaking on behalf of the students because, like you, I've been talking with my students for weeks on end, and some days it seems like they're just completely apathetic about the election, and then some days it's like they are geared up and ready to go. So we can perhaps talk more about that. Let me check in with either Matt or Susan. Do we have any other speakers we need to call on here?
I don't believe we do.
Okay.
And I think let's go to the questions. They are all
there's lots of them. So yes, I will get to them. So what I'm going to do here, since we have so many questions, is I'm going to try to group them together. And the first cluster of questions deals with the relationship between two things, one of which is education and the other of which is information. We're supposed to get, I guess, our ideal civil society is a civil society composed of well-informed voters. So on the one hand, we have quite a few questions that are asking, how can we expect well-informed voters when we have the evidence that we're no longer teaching civics in school, that students don't understand basic economics, so they don't understand how inflation works. And also a little bit, someone said they're kind of angry at the theying of Trump voters. They're not just a giant uneducated mass. So this idea of, what wisdom actually is, and then quite a few other questions with concerns about even if we do have the education to find the information we need, that the information seems more and more to be manipulated. One question was about, did Russia manipulate any information? Others were simply saying, social media and the MAGAverse seems to have dominated the media. So even if we had access to information, maybe we're not getting good information. So this relationship between education and also the kind of information we got, I wonder if you could speak to either or both of those, and I will go through each of the speakers one at a time and let them kind of revisit the issue. So I'll go back to you first, Bill. Would you like to take a stab at that question?
Sure. Very, very briefly, let me step out of my union lawyer hat and put on the hat of having spent 25 years on radio and living with, as many of you know, a woman who was a national journalist. We spend a lot of time talking about the death of local journalism. I think it's fundamental and most important of all, perhaps. Reporters are disappearing at every level throughout the society. And I think part of what we have to deal with is recreating local media. For me, it means I go to Oakland side every day. I go to Berkeley side every day. I support them in every way I can. There are similar kinds of local media showing up. I think we wouldn't have been so surprised by what happened if we still had local reporters on local newspapers throughout the country who really are very much in touch. In terms of what we need to do, are we going to face off against Fox Media and come up with something bigger and better than Fox? I think that's unrealistic. Takes a lot of money, won't happen. But we can recreate, and I know journalists are talking very actively now about recreating local media across the country online in the form of online daily websites. Enough said, Darren.
All right. Agree with that very much. Thanks for the insight. Arlie, would you like to add anything to the question on education and information? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yes. Two things. First, yes, we all need a lesson in civics, however educated we are. But second, part of the lesson that's missing is how to communicate across the partisan divide. And we're not good at that. And that needs to be added to the curriculum. Actually, Pew survey and other research has found that actually liberals are less good at reaching across and less informed about what conservatives think than conservatives are informed about what liberals think. And so we're more in a bubble than we think we are. And education doesn't help. In fact, even highly educated liberals actually get it wrong when asked about a series of positions they think most conservatives take. So I would add that as a need in civics education.
Yes, also agree with that point. Thanks very much for that. Adam, would you like to add anything about information, misinformation, or education?
Well, I think that I certainly agree with Bill that the death of local news media all over the country is a cause for enormous concern, because this is one of the key ways in which we used to be better informed about local politics. I'm not sure that Americans are less informed today than they were 50 or 100 years ago. For the last book I wrote, I spent an awful lot of time reading American newspapers between the years 1917 and 1921. And there were, like 3 or 4 times as many daily newspapers then, maybe 5 or 6 as many times daily newspapers then as there are today, because as we know, the universe of newspapers has shrunk. But by and large, those newspapers of 100 years ago were absolutely awful. They did not do critical investigative reporting. They repeated some extremely noxious lies, which were being put out by the administration at that time. Woodrow Wilson's very, very repressive second term, where he was rounding people up under the Espionage Act and shutting down critical news media. I think my feeling is that the Trump phenomenon, what we've seen happening, is not driven by ignorance as much as by the hope of a magical solution to these very real problems of income maldistribution, increasing inequities in the distribution of wealth and opportunity in this country. The information, the ability to get well educated and well informed about what's going on in the world is certainly out there for anybody who makes the least effort to inform themselves. I think its lack is not the problem. I think it's the economic despair and the rise of somebody who promises a magical solution to this, which will fail, of course.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Adam. We have one speaker left to comment on this, so I'll go to Sandra next.
Yeah, thank you. Well, wonderful comments from all of my fellow panelists. I just add that I think one of the challenges is that, particularly for white students or white young people, is seeing the value of higher education. It's very expensive, and not seeing the connection between that and what that means for their professional possibilities. So the more that we can kind of encourage and, well, one, deal with the cost of college, and then help students see the connection of that to their professional aspirations would be helpful. I also think, it's interesting. I met with a student yesterday, 17, African-American young man, and he was all excited because he's trying to start a project on campus, which he has already gotten the chancellor's support on, how to engage the media through critical thinking. And so they're thinking about it. And I think, yes, we have very limited and, fairly biased news sources, from my opinion, but perhaps we can better equip students to be able to assess that. And the last thing I'd say is that I completely agree with the challenge of talking across the divides. But what I find to be missing in that conversation oftentimes is that we need skills to do that. We tend to think it's going to be this intellectual conversation where we all stay up here in our heads and that we stay calm and rational. But that, for particularly, let's say, Arlie mentioned liberals have a hard time with that because I think sometimes it's really, they see the impact of things coming down the pike, and that gets very emotional. And so one of the things that we do with our students at the center is one, we just spend a lot of time with them of learning how to listen.
Yeah.
Um, and listening and also managing their own emotional responses and giving them emotional regulation tools. So instead of saying, I'm triggered and expecting other people to, change their behavior related to that, because it's not realistic, you're going to be triggered your whole life, but rather to give them the tools to be able to stay present and focused and still be participatory, even when they are having an emotional response. And also the other thing we found is just learning how to be a good listener is transformative. They kind of poo-poo it in the beginning, but then as they start to do it, they recognize that it feels incredibly affirming to have someone really listen to you. And that actually opens up a space for a different kind of conversation.
Thank you, Sandra. So I think that was a nice optimistic thing that we have some things that we can work on, but also look forward to getting us through to the other side, I guess. I'm going to do two things here quickly. We have a speaker that I want to bring into the conversation. That's going to be Michael Baker. But Michael, before I bring you in really quickly, I'll give everybody a heads up where the next question is going so you can think on it. We have quite a few questions, and I had some of these on my Wednesday session, basically saying things like, actually, one of them was directly to me saying, you keep saying the system is strong and it will hold. Give me some real proof. But there are quite a few people who are worried, what will stop Trump? Give me an answer. What will stop Trump from, say, declaring an emergency powers act where he sets aside the Constitution and just takes direct power? What guardrails are there in place that will stop Trump from doing this, especially if the Republicans control the Senate and possibly the House, and we have conservative justices on the court?
Hey, Google, text Jacob Baker.
Someone needs reassurance on that. So think on that for a moment, and I'm going to bring Michael into the conversation here for a few minutes. Michael, go ahead.
Well, that may be a question a little bit above my pay grade, but thank you. I'm very glad to be able to attend this morning because I wasn't well earlier this week, and I don't have prepared comments, but I want to make 2 points from my point of view, which is the first is nobody's talked about the big, ugly thing in the room, which is racism, nationalism, misogyny, and white Christian nationalism. I think that's a big part of what's driving the young men. It's not just the education level, because I have educated graduate level members of my own family who are pro-Trump and won't listen to anything else because, they're anti-brown, they're anti-black, they want women to be subservient, whatever it is. They talk about transgender operations. Your kid can go to school and come home in a different sex. I mean, there's a certain amount of craziness out there, but a lot of people buy into it. But I wanted to comment about the military because probably I have a little more military background than most people in Berkeley. And it's very interesting. I did 2 reunion speeches in the last 6 or 8 weeks to guys that I've been affiliated with for over 40 years. We've been to combat together. We've been to dangerous places around the world, and we are all educational levels and backgrounds. And the talk I gave that they asked for was about, what I think would cause World War III. And if a few of you might have seen that, the first part of the talk, I talk about Ukraine and Russia. Then I talk about Gaza, Israel, and the other part of the Middle East. And the third part, I talk about the confluence of gun violence and hate rhetoric in this country, which I think could trigger World War III. And boy, we're there. I always had to cut the talk short after 1 or 2 of those slides because I could tell my audience wasn't with me. They were with me on the first 2 subjects. They didn't want to hear about gun control or changing Trump's political rhetoric. I gave a few examples of his usual obnoxious comments. And so I would say that the problem is, just like with the letter that I signed with over 800 other national security leaders that we sent out, a lot of them are former Republicans. Most of these guys are anti-Trump, but the enlisted guys that, used to look to us for leadership are very much not in line. So you have a lot of guys, former uniform and current uniform. How about the 200 Marines who actually were part of the group that attacked the Capitol on January 6th? You got guys, former military, current military, and some crazy senior officers like General Mike Flynn. I don't know what happened to him. These guys are not going to hold the guardrails. They're going to support Trump. They're going to want to pursue the white nationalist agenda. They're going to want to do whatever crazy things So I think you need to strap in and stand by, if you'll pardon the allusion to Steve Bannon. I think we have some very, very dark days ahead. Although I would encourage everyone to be as optimistic as you can, because I do think that the younger generation will save us, but they better come out and vote.
All right. Thank you for that, Michael. You got a couple of thank yous also in the chat for bringing up some of these issues. Yes, and I agree with you. I mean, when people bring up the issue of, whether was it just non-college educated or was it educational level, I always like to point out that Steve Bannon has a graduate degree from Harvard University. So I'm not sure education really tells us a lot when it relates in relation to all of this stuff. So I had the question on the table, which was, I think some people need some reassurance that you can't just tear up the Constitution, that something's going to hold if anybody tries to do something tremendously destructive to the checks and balances systems. Michael just said something about, at least parts of the military seem loyal to Trump. So I'm going to go back through the panelists and see if we have any, whether we're going to be in dark days or whether we can put some reassurances out there. And I see Sandra has her hand up first. So I'm going to go to Sandra.
No, I just wanted to echo and just amen everything that Michael just said. There's no question that these dark forces are at work. And I don't know that I have a solution for that, but I don't think there are any silver bullets, including our young people. And to me, it seems like we're going to need to think very strategically. And just to be real, I consider myself part of the progressive left. We have to do some serious soul searching, because I don't think the progressive left has developed a message that can reach across enough of the folks who voted conservatively to pull them back into the fold, or maybe into the fold at all. And that, it's interesting. I was on a call this morning to talk about this, and it's a very sore point for a lot of folks in progressive and democratic spaces right now.
Thank you for that, Sandra. I'll go back to our other panelists. I'm going to go kind of in reverse order this time, just because it's fun to mix things up. And does anybody, I'll just ask one at a time, do you have any reassurance you can give? There was also a question saying, how can I calm my liberal friends down, because they're really freaked out right now? So I'm going to go to Adam first on this one and see if do you have anything you would like to reassure us, or are you going to not reassure us?
Well, here's one way of looking at it, which I hope will be reassuring. We have been in some awful places in this country before. We had several centuries of slavery. We had nearly another century of lynch law and Black disenfranchisement in the South. We got past those places. We also got past a very dark era, 1917 to 1921, when, with the excuse of the First World War, there was widespread press censorship. The US government shut down 75 newspapers and magazines during that period. There was also, under the Espionage Act, widespread imprisonment of people when they wrote things or said things that the government didn't like. During those years, roughly 1,000 Americans spent a year or more in prison, and a much larger number, shorter periods of time, solely for things they wrote or said. That came to an end. All these things I mentioned were very painful periods, but we did get past them. I'd like to turn to Bill, who's the lawyer among us, for an answer to the question that you raised, Darren, about what can Trump get away with legally and constitutionally? Because that was, I think that's a very big part of this question. I'd love to know the lawyer's view on this.
Sure. We've already in my firm begun to have discussions on how we deal on behalf of the labor movement with what's going to be the new complexion of the federal courts. At the federal level, Adam, I think the answer is relatively simple. He is going to have the authority and the power, particularly with the Senate, to appoint a lot of new federal judges at both the district court level and the appellate court level. So we are going to see a lot of bad things happen with respect to federal law. However, what we really have to work with is state law. Progressive movement, whether it's the labor movement, the women's movement, student movement, we will begin using the state courts much more actively than we already do. Somebody asked, gee, what's going to happen to all these lawsuits against Trump? Well, clearly Jack Smith is history because it's a federal and Trump will fire him and that's the end of that case. The DOJ will put it to bed. With respect to the document case down in Florida that Judge Cannon tried to throw out, the federal courts will take care of that. Again, the DOJ will let that die. But he still faces already be convicted under New York state law, and that judge is going to impose a sentence on him. And down in Georgia, we don't know what will happen with Fannie Willis's case because it's been so boggled up because of her relationship with an investigator, and they've stalled it out. We don't know whether the Georgia courts will take care of it. But all I'm trying to say shorthand is at the state level, state by state, there will be effective legal resistance to whatever you want to call it, the Trump movement. But in the federal courts, we will play a very defensive role. We will be trying to minimize the cases we file in federal court, and we will be trying to fight hard against the cases that are brought against us actually going anywhere. But I expect the Supreme Court will continue on its dark path. There are now, 6 truly committed MAGA justices who are free to run pretty ragged on us. And that part won't be good news, but hopefully state by state will have strong legal resistance.
All right. Thanks for that, Bill. So far we don't have a whole lot of optimism coming through, but let's see if Arlie has something to add that maybe some reassurance. Let's see. Arlie, would you like to speak on this point? Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted again, Arlie.
You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I have a double answer to your question, and I'm not sure I can be reassuring, but I have spent 7 of the last years hanging out in Eastern Kentucky in the poorest and second poorest and whitest congressional district in the country. That used to be Democratic, FDR, and now 80% from Trump. And I was there to figure out why and how. These are the shamed people that I just was talking about. But when I talk to them about guardrails, they would say, well, we believe in democracy. We believe in guardrails. We think we have them. And Constitution, no, don't fuss with that. It's almost reified, the Constitution. So if Trump were to try and tear that up piece by piece or even all at once, I see in the people I came to know real resistance to that at the same time. So that's the good news. Bad news is that I talked in a previous book about a deep story of the right-wing deep story. Is that you're waiting in line for the American dream and, you waited a long time. And then these line cutters cut in, women, Blacks, immigrants, refugees, legitimated by a democratic government. So that's the kind of deep story. It feels like a story of the right. One guy in Pikeville, Kentucky, said, that's right. We believe that too, but you have to add something to that story. You're waiting in line, but they're is a bad bully in line who's trying to help all the line cutters. And then there is a good bully. We know the good bully, our right-wing good bully, is not a perfect guy. He's done a lot. He's a sexual predator. We know that. But he's our bully. That's a depressing finding. And it's there.
Thank you, Arlie. So we have something there. Somebody also just added in the chat, maybe the 2026 midterm election can be a guardrail. So we'll see where things go. We're already looking forward to the next election. Really quickly, before I move on to other questions, we'll come back to you, Michael. Do you want to add anything? I know you said dark days are ahead, but do you have a single optimistic anything?
Well, as I said, young people give me hope. I'm not sure the military gives me hope because there's probably as many General Flynns as there are Mark Millies who will do the right thing. An awful lot of my colleagues, were silent. The other thing that worries me is the Republican control of various governments at the state and local level. We saw some of the mishigas in Georgia with the election commission, and we saw these fake collectors. We may have just voted in the last election, not to be pessimistic, but we may have an election like in Hungary where you might cast a vote and who knows what comes out the other end.
Well, Darren, if I can jump in with what keeps me going in terms of optimism. In our history and perhaps all history, every action creates an opposite action. It may not be equal, as they prescribe in physics. But I now get to be a part of a resistance. And I don't know what shape it'll take, and I don't know quite how it'll look, but I look forward to the fact that we're going to get over our laziness, if you will. It's very easy to be on cruise control when you have Obama in office, Hillary almost wins, and Trump is totally disorganized, and then comes Biden. And now I think a real resistance has to emerge. And I don't know what shape it will take. It'll include some of the people who are Michael's friends, who are pretty militant and tough people, but I think there'll be a real resistance that emerge. And then number two, as a corollary to that, the Democratic Party now can't help but go into a very fractious period when it has to reinvent itself, because there's no question that everybody in that party, is going to point fingers at each other. And I don't know that the party as presently structured can stay as ossified as it has been. It's, the tight leadership, that controls the party has now been absolutely blasted completely out of the water. And so there's going to be this combination of a new resistance and a national party trying to reform itself. And it seems to me out of that, there are tremendous opportunities for all of us to participate and partake in. Pretty exciting times. It's scary, but very exciting that we're finally going to be together and living and breathing in a community of opposition.
I like that.
Thank you so much for that, Bill. I think it was also reassuring, also a little bit optimistic. So that's good. I will say this on a very specific point. Somebody had put in in one of the questions something about the Enemy Aliens Act. Is Trump going to really use this to deport millions of people? And this is going to sound weird as a source of optimism, but sometimes dysfunction can be our friend. That Trump has no idea what he's talking about, that piece of legislation, because one of the prerequisites for invoking it is we have to actually be at war with a country. So sometimes just saying things that are completely misinformed means we don't necessarily have to worry that it's going to come true. So there we are. So I have a next set of questions here. I'm trying to group them. We got lots of questions, and thank you everybody for putting your questions in. I'm trying to read through all of them and group them together so you feel like your question got addressed. We have, and Bill, you kind of touched on this, but a lot of people are saying, what comes next for Democrats? Like, what will they learn from this election? Can we expect that we won't repeat the same mistakes? Or where do you think it's going to go? Will the Democrats move to the right to save themselves? Or will they move to the left, stay where they are? What do you think is going to happen? And to To start with all that, let's see, maybe this time I'll start right in the middle of our panelists rather than start at the beginning of the end of our orders. So I will go with, let's say, I'll put Arlie on the spot because I know she likes to be put on the spot. Make sure you unmute yourself. And what do you think might happen with the Democrats?
I think that the Democrats will, and Bill opened this door, coalesce in a way they haven't been able to, and around a move to the left, and they will rediscover social class, which has basically been dropped from its primary agenda in the last 3 decades. This can be a cross-race point of a connection. I'm thinking of a recent book on white poverty by Reverend William Barber, who talks about something, a new alliance. Let's look at class and then looks beyond class at the corporate giants that have helped organize, are certainly part of this class polarization, and to kind of look at lay bare the economic machinery, the deregulation of it. That whole move left, I think, could unite us. And I have to say that a lot of the right-wingers that I've been studying, both in the South and now in Appalachia, really like Bernie Sanders. And there was a lot of excitement about him. We could go with that.
Okay, thank you for that, Arlie. Let's see, how about going next to Sandra Bass? I think she said she also enjoys being put on the spot. So what do you think in terms of either our campus Democrats, or what do you think of the Democrat Party? What do you think if we learn some lessons, where do you think it will go?
Well, I agree with Arlie. There's going to be some serious soul searching. I think what the Democrats need to do, which is very hard, is to figure out how to hold together the coalition, and not be overly influenced by the very loud interests within the party. And those interests can be, a loud and present left. And I'll just speak honestly, I think higher ed and the framing and the abstraction that we've brought into the conversation are part of the problem. I was watching a Democratic strategist the other night, and she was like, you know what, people don't know what you're talking about when you say Latinx. They don't understand us anymore. And not that that's a problem. It's just you have to figure out how to take that and make it applicable and understandable to a broader swath of the American public. I would say the same with corporate interest. I mean, the amount of money that was put into this election, the amount of influence that donors have, in general, is just outsized, and it makes it very hard to put messaging forward that is more class-centered. So I think that's going to be the real challenge for the party as a whole. And again, just thinking about how do we bring in young people into the party and that they feel that they are helping to drive it. One of my former students from last year joined this movement. I think it's called Gen Z Against the Gerontocracy, right? So they're really feeling like, we don't have a place here. You all are not making space for us. That is a losing strategy. I love him, but I don't think we need to be against each other. We need to figure out a way to be an intergenerational movement, if we really want to move forward as a party.
Thank you, Sandra. I will say there was one comment in the chat that said, why isn't there someone on the panel who's representing the youth? So your voice was heard, and maybe in a future event we can do that. And the intergenerational part, just to remind everybody who's an Ollie member, if you want to make that happen, it already happens. I do my intergenerational dialogue every semester. Please join next semester. Well, maybe we'll do it on the election itself. Who knows? Let me just go quickly to the other panelists to see if they have any thoughts on this. Bill, do you have any thoughts on what you think will
Well,
happen?
God save me, Darren. I have 6 thoughts on everything. Most of them are irrelevant and useless. Yeah, I think number one, I don't know what the term soul searching means, to tell you the truth, when it comes to politics. What's really going to happen is a lot of finger pointing, a lot of fighting, and everybody thinking they have the correct line. And out of all that heat, we hope some light will come forth. That's number one. Number two, really, I think there will emerge an understanding consensus that a political party for an entire nation must be about class. I mean, that's where it begins. What the Democrats have become is a series of, if you'll allow me to use the term, interest groups, right? There's the suburban educated women, and then there's the Black women, and then there's the LGBTQ caucus, and you have all of these different groups, and we say, oh, they're all under one tent. Well, the Democratic Party's become this fractious, collection of people who may or may not have common interests. And what Trump's election has clearly shown us is there is class in America. Yes, Virginia, there is class. It didn't go away. And Democrats sooner or later are going to have to deal with class the way that Bernie Sanders was able to. And there will be new leaders that will emerge like Bernie Sanders, like Liz Warren. And we will end up, I hope, whatever the we is, being bound together first on class, and then you'll deal with misogyny, racism, Christian nationalism. As one person was saying to me when we were talking this morning, she said, look, if you're in a fundamentalist church, if you're in the South, to be Christian is to be Republican, because that's what the Christian churches now teach in much of the South. And if you dare be a Christian, particularly in a fundamentalist church, and vote Democrat, you're already in rebellion and resistance to God and Jesus and everything you hold sacred. So there's that whole part of it we're going to have to deal with. But first, you start with class. You don't start with all the disparate groups and somehow pretending they all fit together. So there you go.
All right. Appreciate the insights very much, Bill. I'm going to go to Adam next, and then I'll come back to Michael with an additional question. So, Adam, do you have any thoughts on where Democrats will go from here?
Well, I would certainly like them to go in the directions that Bill and Sandra and Arlie have said. I fear there is going to be a mighty battle about which way the Democratic Party should go. Because there's certainly many voices out there from the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, younger people like AOC, people who've spoken out loud and clear from unions, which in some industries are having a bit of a resurgence. A lot of pressure from that direction. On the other hand, the power of money, as Sandra mentioned, speaks very, very loudly. It was sort of depressing to see that Harris moderated her critical comments about cryptocurrency after people who were big in that industry started giving her money. So I think there's going to be a mighty battle. I think anything that any of us can do to help the side of that battle that looks more squarely at class, talks about income distribution, realizes how that's an issue that cuts across racial lines. The more we can do to make that the focus of the Democratic Party, the better, but it's going to be a mighty battle.
Thank you, Adam. Now I'm going to go over to Michael. And Michael, if you want to speak on this issue, feel free to. But I also want to say there's been a cluster of questions also about something we haven't talked about yet, which is foreign policy, America's place in the world. Some concern over what might happen in Ukraine or in the Middle East. So if you would like to speak to the Democrats, or if you want to just move into a discussion of what do you think is going to happen with Ukraine, feel free to do so. Michael?
Well, thank you, Darren. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but Ukraine is already facing an incredibly dark, cold winter because their power grid's been destroyed. They're not going to have heat. They're not going to have light. That's a miserable way to live. But I can tell you, having been there several times and knowing the people better, they will never, ever give up. They know what it's like to live under Russian rule. They know how terrible it is not to have a free press, how terrible it is not to have a free economy. They know how bad it is that if you disagree with someone, you fall out of a window. They'll never give up. Middle East, I don't have a solution for that Rubik's Cube. everybody's at fault, and I'll stay away from that one. One final comment. Somebody in the chat mentioned the Democrats did not do enough to tout their accomplishments. And boy, do I agree with that. You know, the Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act and all those things, you know, a lot of that money went into building things in red states. And then the red senator or the red congressman would show up and take credit for it. And in fact, you know, Biden, Harris, and their surrogates should have been there holding their rallies right where they're building a chips plant in a red state, right where they were just repaired a bridge. You know, they've done amazing things with our infrastructure in the last 4 years, you know, but only they were able to accomplish it during the first 2 years where they had some congressional support. The last 2 years, of course, nothing happened. So, yeah, they didn't do a very good job advertising their strengths. And, you know, the other part, of course, it would be nice. We could talk about all the things that went wrong. As I said, I think we all have to remain optimistic. We have to remain focused. We have to continue to talk to our neighbors and be civil and try to, you know, go forward on this. It's going to be really tough.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate the, you know, at least getting a little optimism in here and there is always a good thing. Before I go to the next cluster of questions, rather than call on individually on the panelists, would any of you other panelists like to comment on foreign policy? Give you 3 seconds to jump in, and if not,
I'd like that somebody to address China. If Michael wants to take a shot at it. I don't have anything to say about it, but we haven't mentioned it.
Funny you should ask that question. I get it a lot at my talks. You know, if Ukraine gets ground under the heel of Russia, you will see Russia further its expansion into Moldova, perhaps other countries in the area. And you also see China emboldened because we have a president who does not appear to wish, a future president, who does not appear to wish to be involved in any foreign affairs, foreign events, anything that require the U.S. military, which even if we were involved, it would be hard as heck to fight it from here. It's a long way away. And also, he's not very good at holding together our allies. You know, the Biden-Harris administration had China and Japan, you know, become friends after 100 years of conflict. So the China, Japan, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand group, you know, is our best allies to keep China from taking Taiwan. But I think they're going to be emboldened by this administration to, as soon as Ukraine starts to crumble, China might be on the move.
I agree with that. In fact, just to add something to that, Michael, the Xi Jinping, leader of China, has set a deadline of 2027 to try to resolve the status of Taiwan issue, which means the incoming administration is going to be the one that deals with that. So let me go next to another cluster of questions. Many people have expressed a certain amount of dismay at various aspects of money, by which I mean, why did both candidates bring billionaires onto the stage as if that was somehow something we needed to see or be influenced by, whether it was Elon Musk or the others? You know, we celebrated when billions of dollars were raised. There's people that are very concerned about the overwhelming influence of money in the election cycle, and also the fact that that somehow billionaires are the new influencers in politics. I don't think we're ever going to get around Citizens United, but I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on how we might sweep some of this money or billionaire obsession out of politics. And I guess it makes sense to go to the person who talked about money the most in their presentation, and that would be, or income, I should say, and that would be Bill. Bill, would you like to address that question?
I can address it, but I don't think I have anything very optimistic to say. Citizens United is the law of the land. For those who took the Supreme Court case that I gave recently, I presented a chart that shows the incredible increase in the amount of money billionaires are spending in our elections as a result of Citizens United. Now that they can set up PACs, political action committees, and pour as many millions into it as they want, there's a very real fear that I have that as the Democrats duke it out and try to come up with something new, that money will talk, and as they say, money talks and, you know, bad people walk. I fear very much those billionaires. I mean, Elon Musk, you know, he decided he likes one candidate, so he threw him $100 million. And 100 million was just for Pennsylvania, and that's, pocket change off his chest of drawers at the end of the day. He's now worth $285 billion. So, and he contracts with the military for billions. Their communications are more and more dependent upon him. He's sending rocket ships out into space that the US government is very much involved in. His satellite system basically is more or less going to cover the entire world. So everyone's communications depends upon him. So I think the short answer is billionaires will continue to play a very active role in our politics. And in terms of our resistance, the most important opposition we may face are the billionaires buying and selling whomever they want in the political arena.
Yes, thank you for that, Bill. And don't forget the billionaires who control so much of the media. So that's another issue here. I'm going to go through each of the panelists and see if you want to add anything to this, and I'll go in the order of the panel. So, Arlie, would you like to add anything on this issue of money in politics and billionaires being invited onto the stage?
Wow. Well, my head is very much in the minds of the people I've been hanging out with in Eastern Kentucky who voted for Trump, and how do they feel about billionaires? They feel ambivalent. On the one hand, they say, hey, nothing wrong with being a billionaire. I'd like to be one myself. And if I'm not going to hold it against Trump that he is one. On the other hand, if you listen to their talk and actually their music, they don't like billionaires. And these were coal workers in unions, and they disparage billionaires. So there's, I think, an ambivalence. And this reminds me that the power of unions is huge. I mean, this is a group that used to be highly union and highly democratic, and who began to think, through the unions collectively, and to value sharing, not to feel on their own against big money. So somehow, if the Democrats could reinvigorate unions, I think a popular consent to billionaire control would be greatly reduced.
Thanks for that, Arlie. I'm going to just to give everyone else a chance to say something. You don't have to, but if you'd like to add something, I will at least give you the opportunity. Adam, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I think Bob Dylan said it best. Money doesn't talk, it screams. There's no question it's an enormously powerful force. But I would say two things. One, I think what makes Trump the greatest shyster of all time in so many ways is that he managed to get people who are have-nots or who are actually in class positions that are declining in status and wealth and so forth in this country to identify with somebody who has everything. That's an absolutely brilliant shyster and showman at work, and it's something beyond just the power of money and politics. I think it's significant that apparently in this campaign, Harris outspent Trump. So we have to recognize that. I think we can't, much horrible as this influence in big money in politics is, we can't blame everything on that. She spent more money.
Yeah. Good point, Adam. Let's go over to Sandra. Do we have anything to add to this? Again,
yeah, just really quickly, somebody put this, mentioned oligarchy in the chat. And yes, sometimes I feel like we're caught in the battle of the oligarchs, and we're all sort of just pawns in whatever they're doing. At least that's the way it sometimes feels in the media. Getting to Bill's point, which is I agree that a more class-based approach would be more effective, but with the need for money in politics, and having that influence in the Democratic Party, it's going to be very hard to put forward a message that those corporate interests are going to be okay with when it comes to class. So I really don't have an answer other than, wouldn't it be nice if we could get rid of Citizens United? But I don't see that happening anytime
Well,
soon.
keep in mind that both Bernie Sanders and Jerry Brown really started the whole movement. I won't take more than $100 from any one person, and managed to raise huge amounts of money. So I think we may be able to, as we build a resistance and opposition, find other ways to raise money that doesn't involve billionaires. Because I agree with you. Otherwise, there's a very small, and it is an oligarchy, very small group. There's 800 of them in America, and they can determine everything if we let them.
Amen. Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you for that. Now, I do want to say a couple of things here. One of which is I had a few people in the chat saying, is there a way to save the chat, or will the chat be saved? You can do that on your own. You'll have an option. There's 3 dots somewhere in your chat thing. You can click on that. And if you want to save the chat, because if people put a lot of interesting information in there, you can do that. I don't think we're going to save it and then publish it. Well, it's being recorded, but we're not going to do that. Also want to say we have 8 minutes left. So I want to do one more cluster of questions, and I know this is an impossible task for all of you, but I thought we should address it. There's a lot of stuff on the election that was the Democrats lost because they're the party of identity politics. And yet there's also a lot of questions in the chat coming from people who are very concerned that their identity is now under attack, whether it's the LGBTQI plus community, whether it's undocumented workers. I wonder if you could briefly speak to the idea, and I'll give you each, I guess, about a minute of whether you think, for instance, that's a fair characterization that Democrats lost partly because they're obsessed with identity politics, or whether you can reassure those who feel their identities are under attack. And I'll just go in reverse order of the panel, which means I will start with you, Michael.
Oh, you got me. You got me. Okay. So just one comment, and it has to do again with my having been in a couple of veterans groups, both, like I said, the people in my lectures who clearly were not against Trump, and the people who were in the veterans groups I belong to, like the National Security Leaders for America, were very anti-Trump. I think going forward, besides being optimistic, what we need to also do is not just describe the fact that we're against Trump and against Trump's policies. I think we need to enumerate what it is we have to be in favor of. I'm in favor of tightening up gun laws so we don't have mass shootings in our schools. I'm in favor of a better national health care plan so that we don't have 980 insurance plans, and every time you switch employers, you go through this whole rigmarole that no other Western industrialized country has. So I think we need to pick out the things that we think we want to fight for, and I think we need to fight for those and be optimistic and put that on our agenda. The things I mentioned, I am not an expert on, but now that I'm an amateur historian, I get to lecture about it, and it makes it kind of fun. So thank you very much, Darren, and all of you on the panel for speaking out today.
Thanks, Michael. Lots of resonance with that in the comments of people who agree. Let's make it not about Trump, but about ourselves. Really quickly, we're in our last 6 minutes. Let me just ask if there's any final thoughts, either about identity or anything. And I'm going to go in reverse order. So that means, Sandra, any last things to say?
Yeah, just to speak to the issue of identity politics. I mean, America has historically been about identity politics. We just haven't named it that way because we do have these roots in white supremacy and slavery, and people being, their life experiences being defined by those things. I think what has changed is that the progressive left has now leaned into that so hard that they're actually encouraging white people to coalesce around whiteness in a different way than, at least in my lifetime, I have seen. And that's problematic. And so I would like to see, as Michael mentioned, more a broader vision for who we're going to be as a country moving forward. And for the left to be able to articulate that in a way that a much broader swathe of people in the society can see themselves as part of it. The last thing I would mention is there is a person who leads the JPB Foundation, Deepak Bhargava. I'll put his name in the chat. And I think he wrote something recently that was just spot on in terms of what needs to happen with left movements. They're one of the biggest funders of left movements. And he just really nailed that we need to move away from some of the corrosive rhetoric, or at least exclusionary rhetoric, and really think about what does it look like to be more inclusive and to how do we put forward that vision. So I'll put his name in the chat.
All right, thanks for that, Sandra. And really quickly, I will give going to Adam. Do you have any final thoughts or thoughts on identity?
Yes, I don't think the Democrats lost because of identity politics, but I think the Republicans won because of identity politics. Here's what I mean. I think Harris handled herself very well on this issue. She stayed off identity politics. She said, when Trump had made his ridiculous remarks about you were Indian and you became black, she said things like, I'm comfortable with who I am. If he's got a problem, that's his problem. But I think the Republicans won on the issue because Trump made not even a disguised appeal, but often direct appeal to white nationalism. And that's a disturbing thing. And part of his brilliance as a shyster is that he managed to get a large number of Latinos and a small number of Black people to go along with him on this. That's the tragedy.
Well said, Adam. We have two more speakers. We're getting to our 3-minute mark. So Arlie, any final thoughts? Quick thoughts, I guess?
Yes. The Democrats need to realign and reach out. This is following what Sandra was saying. Across races on class lines. And there are people waiting in line to be recognized by the Democrats. I talked to a lot of poor white men who didn't go for Trump, but didn't feel seen by the Democrats. And one guy said, look, I'm trailer trash, okay? And I'm poor, but a Black living in Louisville, he's poor. My family is partly in jail. His is too. I'm undereducated. He is too. I don't see the difference between us. That Black poor person and this me, white poor person, except for the music. And then someone else told me, he was saying we have twangy music and Black poor have rap. And then someone said, you know what? You may not know about hillbilly rap. I have a feeling that actually the artists were better at this crossover that we need than the politicians. So I see hope there.
Good.
If we
have hope
reach out.
get to the end of our presentation. Thank you, Arlie. Last, about a minute left here. So Bill, would you like to add any thoughts to this?
Very briefly, I agree with all the prior panelists. And the thing I want to say in closing, and I mean all of this, dare to struggle, dare to win, dare to snuggle, dare to grin. And I mean particularly the last half of that. As we resist, we have to be able to join together in community and enjoy our lives, be excited by our lives, find joy in everything that we do by being part of communities with other people. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks for helping us end on a better note. I do want to ask really quickly, Susan or Matt, do you want any last words before we sign off here?
Darren, I want to thank everybody who's come today. And obviously, I want to thank you, Darren, and I want to thank each of the panelists, Bill, Arlie, Adam, Sandra, Mike. I think you have contributed enormously. Your perspective, I think, does give us hope just because I think we're grappling with it. And just the act of grappling with it feels better to me than that awful anticipation of what's next, which is also part of what we'll be dealing with. But thank you all. We will be captioning the recording of this town hall, and we will be sending it out, posting it probably within a week to 10 days. So again, thank you, and be well, everyone.